All right. Okay. Again, thank you for your time. And
Sure.
I'm excited to hear about what you do and your experience. And as I was just mentioning, I'd love to hear about your background and how you came to the field of occupational therapy and early intervention.
Sure. So, um, it was actually just telling this story to somebody the other day. So I have an undergraduate degree in occupational therapy. Until the mid 90s, it was a bachelor's. You could enter the field as a bachelor's level entry. And when I was in high school, I was a camp counselor for it was like 8 to 10-year-old girls, I think was my group. And for some reason, our group had a lot of children with disabilities in it. Some that it happened to be the age range. We also had some older girls who were developmentally in that age range, so they put them in our group. And I spent the summer working with them and really enjoyed it. And so I must have been junior year. My guidance counselor calls me down to the office and says, "So, what do you think you want to do when you grow up?" kind of thing. And I said, "Well, I'm interested in physical therapy based on this experience." And for reasons, and I've never found out why, he said, "Have you ever heard of occupational therapy?"
Yeah.
Which I hadn't. And he pulled out some literature, and I started volunteering at our hospital because that was the only way they would allow you to observe. So I had to do like a year's worth of general volunteering at the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And so got to observe in occupational therapy and physical therapy. And it was like, it's so happenstance. Like, it's funny how like I made these decisions based on what was some really faulty and incomplete information. The
Yeah.
day I got to observe a hand therapist who was an occupational therapist. So this was really interesting, kind of detailed work. And the physical therapist, this was in a general community hospital, so nothing, high tech, was basically walking somebody who had a stroke kind of up and down the hallway. So that was like my first, like, well, gee, OT looks a lot more interesting than PT, just, based on this one little experience. And then we had like a United Cerebral Palsy Center in our community. So I got to observe there also. And like there seemed very little difference in that age range of looking at what OT and PT was. So like based on this hospital experience, I went, sure,
Yeah.
OT sounds interesting.
Yeah.
And reality is I am an OT, I'm not a PT. Who knows? So I ended up applying into an undergrad program, and so graduated as an occupational therapist. I knew I wanted to do pediatrics. I knew I enjoyed that. I had done additional field work training in pediatrics specifically, and early intervention, because that was the first job I got when I got out of, when I got done with my training. That's who hired me. And again, it's what I am. Like it's funny how sometimes the universe sticks in front of you exactly what you need. This was the case. I worked in early intervention in Massachusetts. Was a really terrific, transdisciplinary model. There were OTs, PTs, speech therapists, early childhood special educators, and social workers, like in our early intervention program, who all worked collaboratively together. And I love the work. I have since that point in time also now developed skills seeing older children through adolescence, but birth through 3 is really my first love.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thanks for sharing all that. And so just a couple follow-up questions on that. As you just mentioned, so just to clarify, birth to 3 is your, I guess, passion or first love. And you're currently working with that age range, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I do also work with older children. The nature of the work, we do it through the Looking Glass.
Yeah.
Also have well-developed childhood mental health program. And so our developmental specialists consult into that childhood mental health program. So I'm seeing some school-age children as part of that. And we do developmental consultations for Oakland Head Start. So I see preschool children as part of that process.
Wow. Such amazing work. That's great. If you don't mind sharing, so last night I went over briefly what the mission is for Through the Looking Glass, but could
Yeah.
you just describe briefly, if you want, in your own words, what the mission is? And yeah.
So Through the Looking Glass is what we would describe as a kind of a disability community focused organization
Mhm.
that has a specific concern and expertise in providing services for families in which there's disability in the family, including work with parents who have physical, intellectual, or visual disabilities.
Mm.
So a lot of the work we do, even if the child is the focus, the parents may also themselves have disability issues. So a lot of we have an on-site early Head Start program and a home-based early Head Start. So a lot of those families come to us because the parents themselves have a disability,
Mhm.
or we'll get referrals for regional center clients, for our early intervention clients, specifically because the parent also has a disability and they know that we've got expertise in working with that.
I see. Oh, so amazing and interesting and needed.
Yes.
It's oftentimes you don't hear the support for the adult's disability as well. So
Right.
yeah, well, thank you for sharing more about that.
Sure.
Just to back up a little bit, so you mentioned in your experience as you started to develop this interest with occupational therapy that you saw also the physical therapy. And
Yeah.
one of the questions that came up in the class is, what is the difference between occupational therapy and physical therapy?
Right. And I saw in speech therapy too. So these are
Yeah,
three,
and speech therapy.
there's, there are three very distinct professions.
Okay.
Functionally within early intervention, there's often a lot of overlap because you're working with a whole child, but kind of in a nutshell, thinking about the three professions. So the occupation in occupational therapy refers to the meaningful activities that occupy our time.
Mm.
It's a much older use of the word. So occupational therapists are really concerned with our ability to participate in wanted and needed occupations. So we think about occupations as being play, as self-care skills, as social participation. For slightly older children, it's educational participation, it's work.
Yeah.
Caregiving tasks. So we focus really broadly on those kinds of things
Mm.
because of just the way things have gone through history. Occupational therapists end up getting a lot of fine motor training because you need fine motor skills to do a lot of your occupations.
Right.
Because Jean Ayres, who developed the theory of sensory integration, was an occupational therapist. OTs are known for all the sensory work. So that has become kind of a part of what we do.
Mm.
But that's not kind of core to that occupational piece. That's just this sort of add-on set of skills that we seem to have developed over time.
Yeah.
OT has its roots actually in mental health. So
Uh,
still kind of psychosocial foundation and core to occupational therapy, which I think distinguishes us very clearly from physical therapy and speech pathology.
yeah.
For physical therapists, I think they'll say that their goal is kind of regaining motor skills and mobility, and that that's a primary focus. They talk about ability to do activities of daily living, functional independence, but I think for anyone who's ever been to a physical therapist, right, the motor skills are really an emphasis, and that's the case when dealing with young children also.
Yeah.
And speech language pathologists are working on speech, language, and communication quite specifically.
Hmm.
Um, but for all of us, when you're working in an early intervention, you can't just take a little body and work with a mouth, right? That you're working with a mouth that's part of an entire body. And so you're always including all that work. And I have worked both as an occupational therapist, kind of specifically with that focus, and as an infant development specialist. So like kind of at Life Steps, my work currently at TLG in early intervention is as an infant development specialist. That's what our vendorization is for. It's work I've done previously for Contra Costa County. So they hired OTs as infant development specialists. So I've done kind of both of those pieces and find that it becomes kind of difficult to distinguish at some points, kind of how broad or how narrow my role is in those cases.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. And I really appreciate how you described what you do. It's honestly probably the most helpful response I've heard as far as occupational therapy for young kiddos. Um, Even last night, we watched a video with the definition, and I loved how you mentioned the depth of what you get into as far as how all the developmental domains are intertwined. So even just focusing on, like you said, the mental health and um, that domain is important. Um,
On and recognizing for us, many of the occupations that we have to do, particularly young children, they don't do them by themselves, right? When we're talking about things like feeding, you can't understand feeding as a solo act. Feeding is an act that, when you're a very young child, is in very clear collaboration with a parent or caregiver, because the way a child can get fed, it's
yeah,
embedded in the family. So we have to look at all of those occupations as they are embedded in the context. So we're not treating the child, you're working with the child and the family for that kind of success, because there isn't a clear line.
yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's so true. Um, Yeah, I'm so happy you bring up that point. It kind of hits on my next follow-up questions as far as so there's interest in you mentioned self-care skills. Oftentimes, and you can maybe clarify this, but oftentimes you hear the term self-help skills. So I'm not quite sure if those are the same. But if you could just describe about what types of self-care skills, maybe give an example, and then also talk about how you work with not only the child, but also the family.
Sure. So certainly you will work with self-care or self-help, or what OTs call activities of daily living, the ADL skills,
Okay.
if that's a need, for the parent and the child. So it's a whole range of either ability to be fed for a young child and emerging self-feeding skills, maybe something that we are working with a family on, is how to develop those skills. Um, Bathing skills. So from some of our kids, particularly the ones who have sensory issues, may have a really hard time tolerating all of those grooming and hygiene activities.
Yeah.
So kind of working with families on bath time and toothbrushing. And in those cases, even just helping children, they start to learn to wash their hands by themselves, some very early stuff, learning some basic self-dressing techniques, maybe something that also for some children is something we work on.
Yeah.
And then sleep, if we think about sleep as also kind of part of that, those kind of critical routines, maybe something that we're supporting families around.
Yeah. Oh, those are all so important. And that, so just to follow up with the sleep,
Oh, and
that was
toileting. Toilet training is the other
really,
really big
okay.
one that we're often working on. Yes.
Oh, that's another huge one too. So let's see. I'm so
There was
interested.
a question about, right, it was a question about helping children with sleep problems. And
Yeah, there's a couple of questions I could dig into, but I think if you don't mind sharing about what does it look like supporting families with children that are having challenges with sleep? I know it's such a hard subject. I have
I
an
mean,
18-month-old, so
it's a real, it's a really common complaint. So part of the first piece we're working on is trying to dig in what's underlying the child's sleep issue in the first place. So
yeah,
there's lots of things that can be contributing to sleep problems. For some of our children who have sensory needs, that is a major factor in kind of interfering with their sleep. If they're not well regulated over the course of the day, that kind of structured timing of being able to bring themselves down, calm, stay asleep is really disrupted. So in those cases, we are really working with the parents around addressing the sensory regulatory needs in order to improve sleep.
mhm,
Some of our other children, there could be other reasons. If it's an emotion, there are certainly emotional trauma kinds of things. That's not something an OT would directly address, but then we might refer for support around those kinds of issues.
mm,
Um, for some
yeah,
of our children, if they've got some kids have gastrointestinal issues, and so sleep can be problematic if there's a lot of reflux or things like that. And in those cases, again, might be helping the parent identify what we think seems to be the issue, and then getting them to the correct medical professional to address some of those kinds of needs.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful to understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. So also maybe relating to that, but we're learning about in my class routine-based model and
Yes.
working with families within their routines. And I was wondering if you could share what it looks like for you to effectively partner with families in a way where you're working through their routines on these skills.
Yeah, and this is one of the things actually, since the start of telehealth, we've really, as an agency, all the developmental specialists that we're working with have really kind of jumped on this routines-based intervention piece, because it feels, particularly when we're trying to do stuff remotely, it's been a really successful way to enter a family's life. So we find that can be, particularly for a really overwhelmed family, that can be a nice way to start, like, let's walk through the day and kind of get a sense of where some of the challenging routines are. And then kind of allows us to then effectively partner, instead of thinking about like we're going to work on a developmental skill and kind of this decontextualized developmental skill. We can think about what are the times of day that are challenging, where are the routines, and then enter from that point and kind of build outward from there. So, for example, the little girl that I'm working with, for the parents, like, one of the biggest challenges was mealtime. Mom talks about mealtime as being actually like really traumatic. It was the worst time of day for her.
Yeah.
Her little girl had a really hard time sitting still. There had been some textural issues. She refused to be in the high chair. And so that's where we started. And we arranged my visits at meal times, and I would come in and we would do, and we weren't doing feeding therapy. That's not how we were approaching it.
Yeah.
But it was kind of coming in at mealtime to address that as a routine.
Yeah. Oh, so interesting. And I hear in there that, as we've talked about, you're supporting the whole family with that.
Right.
And so, yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, so now I'm guessing you're doing mostly all tele-intervention at this time?
Yes.
Okay.
It's all Zoom all the time. Yes.
Yeah. So this is norm for you, being on this platform. So there's a lot of interest within my class about what did a session look like before COVID, and now what is it looking like now? And there's an interest in that. And then if there's anything else you want to share relating to that.
So this again has been a really fascinating transition for all of us. And I think for all of the EI professionals out there, certainly kind of the language around routines-based intervention and kind of thinking about early intervention as a coaching model was something that was talked about. How well people were really sticking to it, say there still was a very kind of much a tendency that you're going in and you're doing a lot of work directly with the child, that some of us, our practice felt very embodied, right? You had a way of physically being and engaging. And even if you were playing there together with the parent on the floor, there was still, you were using your physical presence. I think in many cases, the families were kind of turning to therapists sort of as the expert. And we work with families in, the East Bay, in Oakland, in Richmond, some of whom have really complex, really stressful lives. When the early intervention professional showed up, this might have actually been a chance to walk away for an hour and let the therapist work with the child and come back and actually have conversation for part of it. But maybe this was the only time to get laundry done or the only time to help another child. So I think there was a lot more of that previously. We also had a lot of flexibility previously. We could go to the park if we needed to. We could, if a parent said, I actually were trying to start at a preschool or, a childcare setting, we could go in and do services there and support the child in multiple different settings.
Yeah.
And then Zoom happened. And we all suddenly had to figure out how on earth we were going to provide services when we couldn't touch a child. And when we were suddenly, again, particularly for the folks that were very embodied in their practice, they were doers, and suddenly they were ahead. And everything that they would do and could show a parent, here's how you do it, suddenly had to come out of their mouths.
Yeah.
We had to kind of really radically rethink how we were engaging when we didn't have our toys, when we didn't have, so, and it has proven to be, in more cases than I ever would have imagined, amazingly successful. And everybody always steps back, like kind of in awe, like, really, this is working so well. In part because parents have had to be really actively engaged, right? That there's no way to do this. We've really had to adopt a strong coaching model that, you know, we're there and it's the parent and the child engaging together, and we're there to support them. That might mean making suggestions about how to engage. That might mean asking questions, create observations. But the parent has much more, or the grandparent or, you know, caregiver has much more ownership now of the process, and it's all them. So there's none of this, you know, the therapist comes in and does something with the child and then hands them back and say, okay, now you do it, which feels really intimidating. And one of the things our executive director said is, like, always don't out parent the parent, right? So easy to come in and you're the cool one and you can make the kid do the things that none of the parent could do, and then the parent just feels bad.
Yeah.
In Zoom, we can't do that, right? It takes away that temptation to be that better parent. So again, for some families, it is proven to be really difficult. We have some families that this is not a successful model, just like we know for some kids, you know, older children, elementary school, high school, Zoom has been the worst thing for their schooling. We have some families that this is just not good. I think some of our families who have children with more severe physical disabilities, they need hands-on PT. There is no getting around it. They're not getting it.
Yeah.
For some of our children with autism, this has been really difficult for families. Like, screen time is not something you want to be doing, and this is challenging. And I guess some of our families just handling the technology, and they don't have good Wi-Fi, or they're trying to manage 4 children at home on Zoom school, and this is difficult. But for an amazing number, and again, even amazing number of high risk, lower income, really stressed families, this has still worked.
So interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm hearing that from quite a few professionals in the field. And I'm happy you mentioned both aspects of the spectrum and talking about that reality. I'm curious, this isn't a question, but I'm curious about it. What do you feel like, with all your experience, and especially now that you're actually living out this time of doing teleintervention, do you feel like we don't even know what post-COVID looks like, right? But do you believe that maybe some of teleintervention will be helpful to continue?
We sure hope so. And that's the message we are hearing from the regional center system via DDS, is that hope is that this will continue as an acceptable form of intervention. And there's, for a variety of reasons, we have some families, particularly in more rural counties, for whom it's difficult to get intervention, difficult to get specialized, like particularly bilingual speech therapy, really difficult to get. Easier to get if you're able to do this through telehealth.
Yeah.
We've got children who are immunocompromised, are frequently ill, and this is an option. If I have the sniffles, I can't go see that kid. If I can do it, I have the sniffles, I'm fine, I can still have a session.
Yeah.
So there's things like that I think the hope is that there will still, and again, it provides us with some flexibility. If you have a telehealth day, that means that maybe that's a day I can zoom in on bath time, or I can zoom in, on mealtime that's really tough, or at that point where maybe it would be otherwise difficult to schedule when I'm out and about driving around.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are all really great points. And I really appreciate you bringing that up for us.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. I just have a few more follow-up
Sure.
questions. So one is, I know that this is always, as myself being an early interventionist, sometimes there would be appointments that were spaced like a month apart. Those would be challenging. But typically, and you can tell me what you are experiencing, but for me, I had most of my sessions were a week apart. And so my students are interested in what does that look like? What is that dynamic? Is that helpful for parents? And with that, do the parents, are they encouraged to keep practicing at home? If you want to just touch upon that topic.
Right. So I think, and like we're talking about, if the whole idea is I'm not going to affect change if you're just relying on me 1 hour a week, when there's 24/7 the rest of it, like,
Yeah.
that's not what I'm there for. That's right. That's not how we're approaching it. And why this kind of really focus on routine-based intervention and coaching models really makes a big difference. And, maybe even trying to think about it, not that the parent is, that I'm showing them something to do and they have a home program like that language, or even, you go to the physical therapist and they give you a bunch of exercises and you've got to do it.
Yeah.
Right? The idea is that what we want to develop is strategies that are embedded throughout the course of the day that are supportive of the child's development,
Mm.
versus like, oh, we've got to practice something. Well, hopefully you're going to spend time sitting and playing with your child. So let's think about, how do we play with your child in ways that maximize the things we want to work on, but again, don't feel like, oh, I've got to drill the kid right now.
Yeah.
Certainly, again, there are some things, again, in very specific situations, children with more severe physical disabilities, as an example, children with cerebral palsy, where like they need their daily stretching. There are things that need to happen, but that's not the bulk of the children that we're working with.
Yeah.
So when I'm in there, it's, it's an opportunity maybe we can try something that maybe the parent was nervous about trying, and we can try it together. And then they've got the freedom to go try it together, or I can watch and see what they're doing and offer a way to kind of modify, or maybe there is something I can show hands-on, but while we're there, mom and dad can practice and we can learn a different way of helping the baby get from sitting down or from down to up. And again, but it's not a practice. It's, gee, every time we pick the baby up, we just help the baby come this way. And it's just part of what we're doing. So is the once a week, well, no, it's the 24/7 that the parents are doing. That's what makes the difference. I'm there pointing them in a potential direction they could go.
Yeah. Oh, I really love that frame of thinking. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so one question I have is, you mentioned in the very beginning about bathing, washing hands. There was a question about if you have any tips or strategies for working with children who do not like those wet textures.
Refer them to an OT. There's my snarky answer.
Yes.
Well, that's what we're going to do. So that's, if you've got a child with sensory processing difficulties, my recommendation is ask for OT and then work with the OT around their strategies. Because there are some general tips and techniques, which is don't force the child to touch things they don't like to touch, because that doesn't make it better. That deep touch is less traumatic than light touch. So there may be ways that we're thinking about how we're engaging with the child that we can offer deep pressure that then allows them to tolerate it, in which the child has more control of the situation, maybe can do stuff a little bit by proxy before they're ready. So if everyone's finger painting, we get to paint with the brush first, and so we can still engage in the activity and we adapt it, and then eventually they want to move towards it. But so, yeah, so kind of generally thinking, but yeah, we never, if we've got a child that, I mean, I've got children, hair washing is a big issue for some of our kids. And one of my recommendations to parents is, do we need to wash their hair that much? Like,
Yeah.
you know what? Let's back away from it. Let's think about what's really, there are things we need to do, right? Sometimes we need to wash your face. Sometimes we need to wash your hands.
Yeah.
Thinking about, are there ways that we can do it that is more tolerable for the child until they're ready to do it. And as much as we can, we try to make it fun. So, you know, even kids that are worried about bath time, can we play with bath crayons in the bathtub without the water?
Yeah.
You know, let's get used to and comfortable, and then we can slowly introduce. So there's a, you know, we've got a little bucket of water with us there instead of it being the whole thing.
Yeah. Oh, great advice. Thank you. All right. So I just have one more question from my students. They were interested in what are the educational requirements to become an OT?
Sure. So right now, occupational therapy is at a minimum a master's degree level entry. There are some programs that have a clinical doctorate entry. So that's, you're coming in, what you're getting is what's called the OTD. For most programs to get accepted, you have to have kind of a set of prerequisites, typically including things like anatomy and physiology, psychology, physics, statistics. There's a fair amount of hard science kind of required, plus some social science, psychology, a lifespan development class. And then programs are anywhere from typically like 2 to 2.5 years for those master's and doctoral programs. There are, like a student teaching requirement, there are 2 what we call level 2 fieldwork experiences that are 3-month full-time positions. So you're doing about 6 months of full-time clinical training in 2 different practice areas. So again, probably sounding very familiar. And then there's a national exam that you have to take. And OTs are nationally registered and then licensed in all states.
Got it. Okay. So a lot of training and background and education.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you for your wonderful and amazing responses and experience and knowledge. Is there anything else that you want to share with us before I end?
I think early intervention is great. I encourage as many people to go into it as they can. I think it's for me, it's always been you develop these really amazing relationships with families. And it's one of the places that you could have really long-term relationships with families in ways that I, you know, haven't had that experience in other areas of clinical practice. I think you just froze on me.